This is John Goodman. I want you to consider the following example. You are a seller or you are a listing broker. You've entered into a contract that was about 30 days ago. The closing for this contract is set for today. And the morning of the scheduled closing, you learn that the buyer cannot close because there's some glitch with the buyer's loan. And the buyer needs 7 more days, an extension of 7 more days to close. Let's also assume that in this situation, there is no longer a loan objection contingency that excuses the buyer from closing on the contract. There is no other contingency that gives the buyer an out in the contract. At this stage, in this contract, the risk that the buyer doesn't get the loan is supposed to shift from a risk that the seller might bear because the buyer has an objection contingency to a risk that the buyer bears because the buyer's earnest money has gone hard in this transaction. So the buyer needs an extension of time. First question, is the seller obligated to grant that extension of time? And the answer to that question, at least in Colorado, is clearly not. The seller is not obligated to grant an extension of time. Let's also be clear that this inability of the buyer to close might cause the seller a lot of grief and damages. The inability for the buyer to close may mean that the seller, because the seller cannot sell their home, has a lack of ability to close on the seller's replacement property. The seller might not have any out in that transaction, and the buyer's default might cause the seller in turn to be in default in another contract in which the seller is a buyer. That also could cause huge damages for the seller because the inability of the seller to close might cause the seller to lose out on the opportunity to buy the replacement property. It might lose an opportunity for the seller to get a loan at a favorable interest rate. Interest rates may go up and the seller might have to get a replacement loan to buy a replacement home at greater interest rates. So this buyer default, this late buyer default in the contract could create a lot of grief for the seller. What can the seller do about it? The point of this video is that sometimes, in spite of the fact that the default is through no fault of the seller, the contract is not God. The contract does not strike the buyer down. A bolt of lightning does not emanate from the contract and strike the buyer down. There are no contract police who throw the buyer in jail for failing to perform on the contract. And it might be in the seller's best interest to grant an extension in some instances. That's something for the seller to discuss with the seller's attorney. The best bad option may be to grant an extension. Now, does that mean the contract is meaningless for the benefit of the seller? No. At least in the standard form that's used in Colorado, the seller has the remedy of what we call liquidated damages against the buyer, and that allows the seller to keep the buyer's earnest money. And if the buyer's earnest money is significant enough, then that earnest money amount may be sufficient to compensate for all the seller's damages. Often it's not. So what can sellers do to protect themselves against this scenario? Well, 3 things I want to talk about. One of the things is it's useful for a seller, all other things being equal, to get as much earnest money as possible from the buyer from the beginning. There's no free lunch with that. The more aggressive the seller is about asking for earnest money, the smaller the pool of buyers that the seller might have to consider among when considering offers. Second thing for sellers to consider is for the seller to have backup contracts. It's nice when buyer number 1 defaults for the seller to be able to quickly slide in a buyer number 2 who can purchase the property. A third thing for a seller to consider is when a buyer wants an extension like that, a way of testing whether the buyer thinks it's likely that this loan problem will be overcome is to try and charge a buyer a fee, an extension fee for extending the contract. This would be a fee that is not applied to the purchase price. It's not something that's paid out of closing. So as far as we know, it doesn't have ramifications for the TILA RESPA integrated disclosure rules that are quite new as of the recording of this video at the end of November 2015. It is not something that's paid on the settlement statements. It's paid simultaneously with the seller granting the buyer the extension. If the buyer isn't willing to pay an extension fee of, say, $500, if the buyer isn't willing to bet $500 on the likelihood that the buyer is going to be able to close on the purchase, then it raises the question, why should the seller consider extending the contract? With that as food for thought, remember what I always say at the end of these things is that if you're watching this video and trying to learn from it for a transaction outside the state of Colorado, it's especially important you consult an attorney who is licensed to practice law in your state. If you're watching this and have questions regarding it, you should consider a Colorado lawyer if it's a transaction in Colorado. And please keep me and my law firm in mind. And remember, it's a complicated world out there. Be careful.